Hi, so today we're going to talk about world migration of the 1800s. So this is something that you're supposed to know for the AP exam in this time period that we're studying, 1750 to 1900. It's not covered really in your textbook very much, and so I like to do a separate little mini unit about this topic to make sure that you fully understand what's going on. So if you look at this map of migration, there's a couple questions here, and you could pause and discuss these questions as a class if you'd like to. Where are the two largest flows of migration going during this according to the map? And then think about what you know about industrialization and imperialism. How might these events have led to migration in the 1800s? So go ahead and pause and you can discuss as a class. So hopefully you identify that there's a lot of people leaving Europe. We see people coming to North America as well as South America. And there's also a large migration from China to other places like Southeast Asia. So a lot of things that cause migration have to do with changes in demography. And remember, demography is the study of population. So there are changes occurring in both industrialized and unindustrialized societies that cause people to have to change the way that they were already living. So one would be changes in food production. So new technology of the Industrial Revolution and new discoveries led to increased food production. Also remember, by this time, a lot of the New World crops, things like potatoes and corn and tomatoes, had spread all throughout Afro-Eurasia and had increased population. So when we have increased population here, sometimes we end up with a surplus of workers. So like if you're in a country where most people traditionally are farmers and now food production is becoming more efficient, you just don't need as many farmers. And so those people need to find a place to work. Also improved medical conditions. So slowly sanitation and medicine was bettering itself in the 1800s. And so this led to an increase in life expectancy throughout the world and increased population growth. And so both of those things meant that, again, in places where there were a lot of farmers, and that had been the basis of their society, they just don't need as many people in agriculture anymore. And so those people look for new opportunities. And we know in the Industrial Revolution, in some places, people moved to cities, but some people were forced to go even further and move to a different part of the world in order to find work due to these changes. So a lot of the migrants moved to cities, which stimulated significant urbanization in both their home country and the countries they went to. So if you think about on the first map, when we saw the flows from Europe to the Americas, a lot of people in Europe were already moving towards the cities because they were moving towards places where they could get jobs in factories as agriculture became more productive. So urbanization is increasing in those places. And then also they're coming to cities where they need workers. So like they're coming to work in factories in the East Coast of the United States, for example, and those areas are becoming more urbanized. And then another key factor is that by this particular time, because of the Industrial Revolution, there were new forms of transportation that allowed people to travel these long distances. So if this had happened at a different time in history, the migration may not have occurred because they didn't have the same technology. So railroads enabled people to travel across continents. So like people arrived in, say, New York and were able to travel west and settle lands in the western part of the United States. And then the steamship. So the steamship allowed people to go, say, across the Atlantic, across the Pacific, throughout the Indian Ocean, and migrate to places that would have been much harder to get to prior to this particular time period. So there's several reasons that people migrated. Some people migrated totally of their own will. Some people migrated under kind of more coerced labor type situations. So first we'll talk about people who chose to migrate freely, relocating, usually in search of work. So examples. A lot of Europeans came over to the United States during the 1800s. to acquire cheap or free land. So my ancestors, for example, some of them who came from Sweden, came to the eastern United States and then migrated to the Midwest in places like Minnesota and Iowa because the government gave away land at a very, very discounted rate in order to get people to move there and start farming. So that's one way. That was called the Homestead Act. Also, people came to take jobs in the growing factories in the United States because the United States industrialization really took off in the 1800s, and so there was a great need for laborers. Another example, Argentina drew lots of workers from Southern Europe, places like Italy. Japanese workers often sought out agricultural jobs throughout the Pacific region, places like Hawaii, for example. Another example we have here, we have Fredericksburg, Texas. So if anybody's ever been to Fredericksburg and you know that it has a lot of German heritage. So people tended to come like in groups from the region that they went to and settle kind of together in a cluster. So Fredericksburg is an example. I gave the example like where some of my relatives settled in the northern Midwest. There are a lot of people from Scandinavia who came to settle there. Another thing we should know by now is that slavery was definitely on the decline throughout Europe and the Americas. So due to the Enlightenment and new ideas about natural rights and things like that, slavery was being outlawed throughout the 1800s. And so people came to rely on different forms of labor. And one of those was indentured servitude. So indentured servitude, we talked about back in the previous time period, 1450 to 1750, as being used in the Americas, and it was. But it especially grew in prominence as slavery was outlawed, and people who owned plantations, for example, still needed a lot of workers, and so this was one way that they got those people. So a little review of that. Indentured servitude required workers to sign a contract tying them to a job for a specific period of time. So maybe like anywhere between often 7 to 10 years. And in exchange for that, the employer would pay for your journey to come to wherever you're going, like on your ticket on the steamship or whatever. They often targeted men as agricultural workers. And again, this should make sense because we know slaves were commonly used in agriculture, and so it makes sense that now they are wanting to replace that labor. And another unique thing about indentured servants in this time is that people within an existing colonial empire often relocated to another part of the empire as an indentured servant. So for example, there's a lot of Indians that left India as a result of the famines that occurred after the British took over and went as indentured servants to another British colony. So the fact that Europeans had these large global empires in some ways kind of facilitated the movement of people. The most common groups of people who became indentured servants in this time, which you'll learn more about in an indentured servant TBQ you're going to look at, were Africans, Asians, and Pacific Islanders. And then another form of coerced labor during this time were convict labor systems. And probably the most famous example of that is Australia. So Australia began as a British penal colony where they sent criminals. And so at this time, sometimes you could be sentenced when you're convicted of a crime as part of your punishment to go live in a separate place and have to do forced labor to like pay off kind of your debt to society. And so that's how Australia began. So people had differing views on migration at this time. The 19th century, until about 1914, which is the beginning of World War I, a lot of governments had very few restrictions on immigration or emigration or people leaving, coming, either way. A lot of people viewed immigration as a beneficial process. So for the countries where people are leaving, a lot of times those countries had kind of too many people. They had a surplus of workers. And so it's probably a good thing that some of these people are going out to find jobs in other places. And then for the places they're going, like say the United States at the time in the 1800s, a lot of land was settled. They took a lot of factory jobs that needed to be filled. So it provides needed labor to places that don't have enough. One impact of this on the home society is that it tended to skew the gender ratios. So because a lot of the jobs were pretty tough agricultural work, a lot of the migrants tended to be male, and at first at least left their wives and families behind to go like start a new life in a new place, then possibly bring their family over later. But this meant that in the home societies, women tended to take over jobs that had previously been done by men. And so there's a question here: what other instances of migration have created gender imbalances in societies we've discussed this year? So there should be a real evident example to you, which you can pause the video and discuss, something about labor systems that we've previously studied. And then when you're ready to unpause, you can go on to the next slide. Another impact of migration on the places that people went to is the creation of ethnic enclaves. So an enclave is like a place within a place. So this would be a part of a particular city or region that's dominated by a single culture, and where people from one place tend to settle in the new place like all together as one group. This helps to bring their culture with them into the new environment, and it also helps to facilitate the development of migrant support networks. And it gives you some examples here, like Williamsburg in New York City was settled primarily by Jewish immigrants and still has a very heavy presence of that culture today. Chinatown in San Francisco, for example, is another one. And the question on your paper is, how might this help people adapt to life in a new place? So if you'd like to, you can pause and go ahead and discuss that for a minute. So hopefully you discussed it, and a big part of this is that it helps people to assimilate to the culture, because there'd be immigrants who were already there for a little while who kind of know the city. Maybe they know a little bit of the new language. They can help people who are coming over and have no experience there, don't speak the language, anything like that. They can help them get a job, find a place to live, meet new people, things like that. So the fact that people settled in these ethnically specific communities help them to get established in the new place that they're living. So there also are negative reactions to immigration, and over time, receiving side societies did not always embrace immigrants, and immigrants often became the target of racial and ethnic prejudice. So you're going to look at, maybe not right now, but possibly tomorrow, two specific policies that you need to know: the Chinese Exclusion Act, which took place in the United States, and then the White Australia policy, which, as you can guess, took place in Australia, where specific ethnic groups were kept out of those regions. And if you'd like to, there's a discussion question here. So you can talk about this cartoon and what you think it reflects and what it means, and how people think about immigration today in the U.S., and have a little discussion and answer number 12.